A poor woman lets a shivering man sleep on her couch, thinking it's just a small act of kindness on a freezing night. But what begins as compassion quickly spirals into something far more shocking. This stranger isn't who he appears to be, because hidden inside his ragged coat is a secret worth millions. She thought she was helping him survive the night, but soon, her entire world is turned upside down. A ruthless landlord threatens to throw her out. A broken family steps back into the light. And a choice she makes in her tiny apartment could change everything she thought she knew about love, dignity, and faith. Why did a millionaire end up on her couch? And when the truth is revealed, will it save her life or break her heart forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The November wind whistled through the empty streets as Ruth Miller made her way home from another long shift at the Second Chance thrift store. Her worn boots scraped against the cracked sidewalk, each step sending jolts of pain through her arthritic knees. The thin beige coat she wore, a remnant from better days, did little to shield her from the biting cold. Street lamps cast lonely pools of light as she shuffled past darkened storefronts. Ruth pulled her coat tighter, her weathered hands trembling from more than just the cold. At 68, these walks home seemed to get longer every day. As she approached St. Matthew's Church, something caught her eye. A dark shape huddled on the concrete steps, barely moving except for violent shivers that shook its entire frame. Drawing closer, Ruth realized it was a man curled up against the bitter night air. His jacket was threadbare, more holes than fabric, and his beard was wild and unkempt. Scuffed shoes with splitting soles offered little protection from the freezing ground. Ruth's heart clenched. She knew she should keep walking. A widow alone at night had no business approaching strangers. But watching his breath form desperate clouds in the frigid air, she couldn't bear to leave him. "Dear Lord, guide me," she whispered, then carefully approached the steps. Kneeling down despite her protesting joints, she gently touched his shoulder. Sir, can you hear me?" The man stirred, blinking up at her with bleary eyes. Even in the dim light, she could see exhaustion etched deep in his face. "You'll freeze to death out here," Ruth said softly, her grandmother's heart aching at his confused expression. "I have a warm apartment just down the block. Please, come with me." Every lesson about stranger danger screamed in her mind, but something in his lost expression reminded her of her late husband Thomas in his final days. That same look of someone who had given up hope. The man struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough from disuse. Ruth led him slowly down the street to her small apartment building, supporting him when he stumbled. Inside her modest home, she quickly grabbed her softest blanket from the hall closet and laid it on the worn floral couch. "Sit here," she instructed, turning up the thermostat a notch despite knowing it would strain her budget. "I'll make some tea to warm you up." In her tiny kitchen, Ruth's hands shook as she filled the kettle. What was she thinking, bringing a strange man into her home? But as she watched him huddle under the blanket, looking lost in her living room, she couldn't regret it. "I'm Andrew," he said hoarsely when she handed him a steaming mug of chamomile tea. "I don't know how to thank you for this kindness." "Ruth Miller," she replied, trying to smile naturally despite her nerves. Just get warm." Later, as she locked her bedroom door and slipped into bed, Ruth stared at the ceiling. Had she just made a terrible mistake letting a stranger into her home? Or was this one of those moments her mother used to talk about, when doing the right thing meant taking a leap of faith? Sleep was long in coming, as she wondered which it would turn out to be. Morning sunlight crept through Ruth's thin cotton curtains, casting pale stripes across her worn linoleum floor. She paused in her bedroom doorway, heart skipping when she spotted Andrew sitting at her small kitchen table. He sat perfectly still, hands folded, like someone unsure of his place in the world. The blanket she'd given him was already neatly folded on the couch's arm, each corner precisely aligned. Ruth smoothed her gray hair, tucked into its usual bun, and stepped into the kitchen. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her lingering uncertainty. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller," Andrew replied softly. His voice carried a polish that seemed at odds with his shabby appearance. She moved to the coffee maker, her constant companion of 15 years. "I'm afraid the coffee's not what you might be used to." she apologized, measuring out the store brand grounds carefully. "It's a bit weak. I have to make it last." "Any coffee is a blessing," Andrew said. His grateful smile made the wrinkles around his eyes deepen. "Thank you." While the coffee percolated, Ruth pulled out 2 pieces of bread and her half-empty jar of strawberry jam. Her fingers worked methodically, spreading the jam thin to make it last longer. She set a piece before Andrew and took the other for herself. As they ate their modest breakfast, Andrew cleared his throat. "I used to work in business," he offered, his eyes focused on his toast. "Had a good life, until everything fell apart. Been wandering since then, trying to find my way back." Ruth noticed how he chose his words carefully, like someone used to speaking in boardrooms rather than on street corners. His vague explanation held holes big enough to drive a truck through, but there was something genuine in the way his shoulders slumped when he spoke of his past. "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns," Ruth said diplomatically, rising to rinse her cup. She glanced at the clock. "Time for work. I need to head to the store now. If you leave, please lock up. There's a spare key under the blue flower pot by the door." She hesitated, then added, "You're welcome to stay if you'd like." The words surprised her even as she said them. When Ruth returned that evening, her apartment key felt heavy in her tired hands. She pushed open the door and stopped short. The familiar musty smell of her apartment had been replaced by something warm and savory. Her shelves, usually cluttered with knickknacks and old magazines, stood newly organized. The sink, which had held breakfast dishes, gleamed empty. A pot simmered on her stove, and Andrew stood beside it, wooden spoon in hand. "I hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the soup. "I wanted to show my gratitude somehow." Ruth set down her purse, touched by this simple act of kindness. They sat together at her small table, steam rising from their bowls. The quiet that settled between them felt different now, still cautious, but softer around the edges. Ruth kept her guard up, years of wisdom telling her to be careful, but something about Andrew's gentle presence made the evening feel less lonely than usual. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Ruth gathered her worn canvas bags, preparing for another day of sorting donations at the thrift store. As she reached for a heavy tote, Andrew stepped forward. "Please, let me help," he said, gently taking the bag from her hands. "I'll carry these for you." Ruth hesitated. "The store's 6 blocks away." "All the more reason to assist," Andrew insisted, his tone kind but firm. Something in his manner reminded her of someone used to making decisions. They walked together through the morning chill, Andrew carrying the heavier bags while Ruth clutched her purse close. At the store, the bell chimed as they entered. Marie, her co-worker of 5 years, looked up from behind the register. Her eyes widened at the sight of Andrew, taking in his ragged appearance. Throughout the morning, Ruth noticed the sideways glances from regular customers. Mrs. Thompson, who came in every Tuesday for paperback romances, clutched her handbag tighter when Andrew passed. Mr. Jenkins, their elderly book donor, watched with narrowed eyes as Andrew helped sort boxes. "He's staying with me temporarily," Ruth explained quietly to Marie, who had been hovering nearby. "He's been nothing but helpful." "If you're sure," Marie whispered back, concern etching her face. "Just be careful, Ruth." "I am," Ruth replied, straightening her shoulders. "He's a gentleman who's fallen on hard times. That's all." That evening, Ruth gathered their laundry, including Andrew's threadbare coat. As she checked the pockets before washing, her fingers brushed against something leather. She pulled out a checkbook, intending to set it aside, but as she moved to place it on the counter, it fell open. Ruth's heart nearly stopped. The balance, written in neat numbers, showed more money than she'd ever seen in her life, more than she'd earned in 20 years at the thrift store. Her hands trembled as she quickly tucked the checkbook back into the coat pocket, her mind spinning with questions. During dinner, she watched Andrew eat his simple bowl of soup, noting how he held his spoon with perfect manners despite his rough appearance. When he thanked her for the meal, his cultured voice carried a weight she hadn't noticed before. "This means more than you know," he said softly. Ruth nodded, wondering what secrets lay behind his grateful words. What would drive a wealthy man to sleep on church steps in the cold? Later that night, she knelt beside her bed, as she had done every evening for the past 40 years. "Dear Lord," she whispered, clasping her hands tightly, "grant me wisdom, show me what to do." The checkbook's discovery weighed heavily on her heart, pulling her between suspicion and her natural inclination to trust. "Help me understand," she continued, her whispered words barely audible in the quiet room. "Is he running from something or someone? Should I be afraid? Or is this part of your plan?" She remained there, seeking guidance in the stillness, while questions continued to circle in her mind. Ruth's hands trembled as she ladled hot soup into 2 chipped bowls that evening. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed against her conscience like a physical thing. Steam curled up from the vegetable soup as she set the bowls on the scratched kitchen table, where Andrew sat with his usual quiet patience. After several spoonfuls eaten in silence, Ruth couldn't contain the question any longer. "I need to ask you something," she said softly, her voice wavering. "When I was doing laundry, I found your checkbook." Andrew's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, his weathered face growing serious. "Ah," he said simply. "I wondered when you might bring that up. Is it really yours?" Ruth asked, her fingers twisting her napkin. "All that money?" Andrew let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging as if a heavy burden had settled on them. "Yes," he admitted. "I used to run Carter Industries, had millions in the bank, a mansion in the suburbs, everything money could buy." His voice grew bitter. "What I didn't have was anyone who saw me as just Andrew. My business partners, men I'd trusted for 20 years, tried to force me out of my own company. And my daughter Emily," his voice cracked. "She stopped speaking to me years ago, said all I cared about was the bottom line." Ruth sat in stunned silence, her soup forgotten. "So you just walked away from everything?" "I needed to find out who I really was," Andrew said quietly, whether anyone could see past the dollar signs to the man underneath. His eyes met hers. "You did, Ruth. You helped me without knowing anything about me." "I don't want your money," Ruth whispered firmly. "Just your honesty." "I know," Andrew replied. "That's exactly why I trust you." Their moment of understanding was shattered the next morning by heavy knocking. Ruth opened the door to find Mr. Harris, her landlord, standing there with his usual scowl. "Rent's 3 weeks late, Mrs. Miller," he announced loudly enough for the whole hallway to hear. His gaze flickered past her to Andrew, and his lip curled. "Taking in strays won't help pay what you owe." Ruth's face burned with shame. "I'll have it soon, Mr. Harris, I promise." 2 weeks, he sneered. "Then you're out. Don't care how long you've been here." He turned on his heel and stalked away. "Let me help," Andrew said quietly once the door was closed. "Please. I have more than enough." "No," Ruth cut him off, her voice tight with wounded pride. "I won't take charity. Not even from a friend." That night, Ruth lay in her bed, listening to the tick of her old alarm clock. The weight of possible eviction pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Andrew's wealth could solve everything, but accepting his help felt like admitting defeat after years of managing on her own. She wondered if her act of kindness on those church steps had brought her salvation or her undoing. Frost crept across the window panes as November deepened its grip on the city. Inside Ruth's small apartment, a new routine took shape, though tension lingered in the air like static before a storm. Andrew moved through the space with quiet purpose, his presence both comforting and unsettling. Each morning, Ruth would find him already awake, methodically going about various tasks. He fixed the squeaky kitchen cabinets that had bothered her for years, using tools borrowed from the building superintendent. The careful way he worked reminded her that this man once ran a company worth millions. "These hinges just needed a little attention," he'd said, demonstrating the smooth swing of the sawn cabinet doors. Sometimes the simplest things make the biggest difference. The neighbors began to notice him too. Mrs. Chen from apartment 4B watched with surprise as Andrew carried her heavy groceries up 3 flights of stairs. Mr. Patterson from 2A raised his eyebrows when Andrew helped him move a stubborn air conditioning unit. They still regarded him with suspicion, but Ruth saw how his quiet kindness slowly chipped away at their wariness. In quiet moments, Ruth observed his habits, the precise way he folded sheets into perfect rectangles, how he always kept a sharpened pencil nearby, and the careful notes he made in a worn leather journal. These weren't the actions of a drifter, but of a man accustomed to order and purpose. One particularly cold evening, they sat in her cramped living room, steam rising from cups of tea. The radiator clicked and hissed, fighting against the chill seeping through thin walls. Andrew's voice was soft when he asked, "Tell me about your husband." Ruth's hands tightened around her teacup. "James," she said, the name still catching in her throat even after 5 years. "He worked at the post office for 30 years, never missed a day." She paused, memories washing over her. "The hardest part isn't just losing him. It's how the world treats you differently when you're old and alone. People look right through you sometimes, like you've become invisible." Andrew nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's partly why I left it all behind," he admitted. "The money, the power, it was like a wall between me and real connections. Everyone wanted something from me, but nobody wanted to know me." He set his cup down carefully. "I needed to find out if I could still matter as just me." Their words filled the small room with a delicate understanding, as fragile as spun sugar. But the next morning, reality shattered their growing peace. Taped to Ruth's door was an official eviction notice, the harsh legal language leaving no room for hope or negotiation. Ruth's hands shook as she pulled the paper from the door. Tears blurred her vision as she read the cold demands. She had to leave her home of 15 years, the walls that had witnessed her joys and sorrows, that still held echoes of James's laughter, would soon belong to someone else. The morning sunlight did nothing to lift Ruth's spirits as she mechanically sorted through donations at the thrift store. Her hands moved automatically through familiar motions, but her mind kept circling back to the eviction notice waiting at home. Every time she thought about it, her chest tightened with anxiety. She was arranging a display of second-hand sweaters when a familiar figure appeared in the store window. Andrew stood there, holding up a paper bag with a gentle smile. Ruth glanced at the clock. It was barely noon. "You need to eat," he said firmly, holding the door open. "I brought sandwiches." Ruth started to protest, but her supervisor Margaret nodded encouragingly. "Go on, take your break. You've been quiet all morning." Outside, they settled on a wooden bench. The air was crisp, and Ruth pulled her thin cardigan tighter. Andrew unwrapped turkey sandwiches on fresh bread, far better quality than Ruth usually allowed herself. "You shouldn't have spent money on this," she murmured, though her stomach growled at the sight. Andrew's eyes crinkled with kindness. "Ruth, there's no shame in accepting help sometimes. Forgiveness isn't just about forgiving others, it's about forgiving ourselves too." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You've been carrying this burden alone for so long. Pride can be a heavy weight." Ruth took a small bite of her sandwich, letting his words sink in. "I've always managed on my own," she said softly. "And you've done admirably," Andrew replied. "But managing alone and choosing to be alone are different things." They finished their lunch in companionable silence, watching people hurry past on the sidewalk. When Ruth stood to return to work, Andrew touched her arm gently. "I'd like to stay longer, if you'll let me," he said. "I can volunteer at St. Michael's Soup Kitchen, give something back to the community." Ruth hesitated, studying his face. The thought of him leaving made her heart sink more than she wanted to admit. Over these past days, his presence had filled empty spaces she'd grown used to ignoring. "All right," she found herself saying, "but you'll need to get some proper winter clothes." That evening, as the clock ticked past 10, Ruth found herself in the kitchen with Andrew, preparing chamomile tea. The familiar routine of heating water and selecting mugs felt different now, warmer somehow. She watched as Andrew carefully measured out the tea leaves, his movements precise and thoughtful. The realization hit her suddenly. She had grown accustomed to having him there, to sharing these quiet moments. The apartment no longer echoed with emptiness. His presence had become a comfort she hadn't known she was missing, and that thought both soothed and frightened her. They sat at the small kitchen table, steam rising from their cups, and Ruth felt the weight of unspoken words between them. She had spent years building walls around her solitude, convinced it was safer that way. Now those walls were developing cracks, and she wasn't sure whether to patch them or let them crumble. The days began to take on a gentle rhythm as winter settled more deeply into the city. Andrew and Ruth fell into step together on their way to St. Michael's Soup Kitchen, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Though Andrew's coat was still threadbare, his shoulders carried a new purpose. "I used to walk past places like this," Andrew admitted quietly, as they approached the brick building. "Never thought I'd be serving meals here." Inside, the kitchen hummed with activity. Volunteers bustled about, stirring huge pots of soup and arranging bread on plastic trays. Andrew rolled up his sleeves and stepped right in, his natural authority showing in the way he organized serving stations and coordinated with other helpers. Martha, one of the regular volunteers, leaned close to Ruth. "Your friend there, he's got quite a way with people for someone who's been on the streets." Ruth opened her mouth to correct her but stopped. She watched as Andrew knelt beside a young man whose hands were shaking, whose eyes held the desperate look of someone fighting addiction. The young man couldn't have been more than 25. "One day at a time," Andrew was saying softly. "That's all any of us can do. What matters is that you're here now, trying." The young man nodded, wiping his eyes with a paper napkin. Andrew's words seemed to reach him in a way that suggested years of leadership experience, not the harsh authority of a businessman, but the gentle guidance of someone who had faced his own battles. Later that evening, back in Ruth's apartment, she pulled out old photo albums from her bedroom closet. The covers were worn, the pages slightly yellowed, but the memories inside remained vibrant. "That's Thomas," she said, pointing to a photo of her late husband beside a Christmas tree. "He always insisted on the biggest tree that would fit through the door." Andrew's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. His eyes grew distant, filled with a sheen of tears he tried to blink away. Ruth recognized the look. It was the same one she saw in the mirror on days when memories of Thomas felt particularly close. "Emily loved Christmas too," Andrew said quietly, speaking of his daughter. "We used to spend hours decorating together." He swallowed hard, and Ruth noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he turned the page. As they sat there, surrounded by memories captured in faded photographs, Ruth felt moved to pray silently. "Lord," she thought, "I see your hand in this. Two broken people, finding healing in unexpected ways. Please show us where this path leads." The evening passed with gentle laughter and shared stories, each photograph unlocking another memory. Through it all, Ruth couldn't help but notice how natural it felt, sitting there with Andrew, building bridges between their separate pasts with every page they turned. Saturday morning light streamed through Ruth's kitchen window, catching dust motes in its gentle beams. Andrew sat at the small table, his coffee growing cold as he stared into its depths. Ruth noticed the way his shoulders hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. "Ruth," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you think broken ties can ever really be mended?" She paused in drying her breakfast dishes, the worn dish towels still in her hands. The question struck deep, touching memories she usually kept carefully tucked away. "My Jimmy," she began slowly, setting the towel down. "He was only 23 when we lost him. We had argued about his choices, his friends. I was so sure I knew best." She settled into the chair across from Andrew. "The last few months before the accident, we barely spoke. I kept thinking there would be time to fix things." Her fingers traced patterns on the worn tablecloth. I wish I had put aside my pride sooner. Sometimes I dream about all the things I never got to tell him." Andrew's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "I have a daughter," he confessed, the words seeming to catch in his throat. "Emily, the divorce was ugly, and I let my anger keep me away. Years have passed, and now," he shook his head, unable to continue. Ruth reached across the table, her weathered hand covering his. "How long has it been?" "Too long. 5 years. Maybe more. I threw myself into work, told myself I was too busy. The truth is, I was afraid." "It's never too late," Ruth said firmly. "Family is worth any risk, Andrew. Even if they slam the door in your face, at least you'll know you tried." That evening, Andrew sat at the kitchen table again, this time with paper and pen before him. Ruth pretended to read in her armchair, but she watched as he started and stopped, crumpling sheet after sheet in frustration. "Dear Emily," he would begin, then shake his head. The torn papers piled up like fallen leaves around him. Finally, Ruth set her book aside and walked over. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the tension there. "Sometimes," she said softly, "words aren't enough. Sometimes you just need to show up." Andrew lifted his head, meeting her eyes. In that moment, something passed between them, understanding, support, a shared knowledge of loss and hope. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his shoulder. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the silence, marking time as two lonely hearts found comfort in their quiet connection. The next afternoon, sunlight warmed Ruth's small living room as Andrew paced back and forth, her landline phone clutched tightly in his trembling hand. Ruth watched from her kitchen doorway, her heart aching for his obvious distress. "You can do this," she encouraged softly. "Just speak from your heart." Andrew nodded, took a deep breath, and dialed the number he'd memorized years ago. The ringing seemed to echo through the quiet apartment. Then, suddenly, a woman's voice answered. "Hello?" Andrew's face paled. "Emily? It's Dad." The silence that followed felt endless. When Emily finally spoke, her voice shook with barely contained emotion. "Why are you calling now, after all this time? I know I don't deserve to ask, but..." Andrew's voice cracked. "Would you meet with me, please?" Ruth could hear the muffled sound of Emily's breathing through the phone, the weight of years of hurt hanging in the air between father and daughter. "Where?" Emily finally asked, her tone guarded. Andrew glanced at Ruth, who nodded encouragingly. "I'm staying with a friend. Her name is Ruth Miller. We could meet here, neutral ground." After another long pause, Emily agreed, though her reluctance was clear. They set the time for later that afternoon. Ruth sprung into action, pulling out her late husband's treasured recipe card for cornbread. "Tom always said nothing breaks the ice like warm bread," she explained, measuring ingredients with careful hands. The familiar motions of baking helped calm her own nerves as she watched Andrew straighten the living room for the 20th time. At precisely 3 o'clock, a knock echoed through the apartment. Ruth opened the door to find a young woman with Andrew's eyes, holding the hand of a small boy. Emily's face was a mask of careful control, but Ruth could see the emotion swimming beneath the surface. "Welcome, dear," Ruth said warmly, ushering them inside. "I'm Ruth. And who's this handsome young man?" The little boy smiled shyly, peeking around his mother's legs at Andrew, who stood frozen in the middle of the room. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife as father and daughter faced each other for the first time in 5 years. Before anyone could speak, the boy broke free from his mother's grip and walked straight to Andrew. Without hesitation, he climbed into his grandfather's lap as if he belonged there. Andrew's hands automatically steadied the child, his eyes wide with wonder. Then, in the clear, innocent voice of childhood, the boy whispered words that stopped time. "Mommy says you're my daddy." Tears spilled down Andrew's weathered cheeks as he held his grandson. Emily pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ruth quietly stepped back, watching as years of pain and separation began to crack and crumble in the presence of a child's simple truth. The cornbread's warm, homey scent filled the small apartment as 3 generations sat together, connected by blood and separated by history, while afternoon sunlight painted them all in gentle gold. The evening light softened as it filtered through Ruth's thin curtains, casting long shadows across her small living room. Emily sat perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Andrew leaned forward in the armchair across from her. The distance between them seemed both vast and fragile, like a bridge made of spider silk. "I've missed so much," Andrew said softly, his eyes following his grandson, who was contentedly working on a wooden puzzle at Ruth's kitchen table. "I didn't even know I had a grandchild." Emily's voice trembled slightly. "There were so many times I wanted to call, especially when he was born. But I was still so angry, Dad. The way you chose work over everything else." "I know," Andrew replied, his shoulders heavy with regret. "Money became my whole world. I thought I was providing for you, but I was really just hiding from what mattered most." Ruth kept her hands busy at the table, helping the little boy fit puzzle pieces together while stealing glances at father and daughter. The boy's tongue poked out in concentration as he worked, reminding her so much of her own son at that age. "He needs to know where he comes from," Emily admitted after a long pause. "But Dad, I can't handle being disappointed again. He's too young to understand being let down." Andrew moved to kneel beside his daughter's chair, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Emily, I promise you, I'm not that man anymore. These past months living simply, helping others at the soup kitchen, it's shown me what really matters. I don't want to be the rich man who lost his family. I want to be the father who found his way back." Ruth's heart swelled as she watched Emily's rigid posture slowly soften. The miracle unfolding in her humble apartment felt almost too precious to witness. She quietly excused herself to take out some trash, giving father and daughter a moment of privacy. But in the hallway, her breath caught in her throat. There, stark against her door, was another eviction notice. The harsh red letters seemed to mock her. Moment of joy, reminding her that her own story wasn't heading towards such a happy ending. The deadline glared at her. 3 days. Ruth quickly pulled the notice down, crumpling it in her fist along with the trash. Her chest ached with the weight of her pride. How could she burden Andrew with her problems now, just when he was rebuilding his relationship with Emily? No, she decided. This was his moment of redemption. She wouldn't let her struggles taint it. When she returned, she wore a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She watched Andrew hug his grandson goodnight, saw Emily's tentative smile as they made plans to meet again. But as the door closed behind them, Ruth felt her heart sink to her shoes. She had helped bring this family back together, but now it was time to step aside. Her chapter in Andrew's story was ending, even as his new beginning was just taking shape. The morning sun barely touched the windowsill when Ruth began her somber task. Her arthritic fingers trembled as she pulled out old cardboard boxes from beneath her bed, the dust making her sneeze. She worked methodically, wrapping her few precious items in newspaper: the chipped teacup her husband had given her on their first anniversary, the silver-framed wedding photo, her mother's tarnished costume jewelry. Each item held a memory, and each memory weighed heavier than the last. Ruth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to stay quiet as she heard Andrew stirring in the living room. The last thing she wanted was his pity, but her red-rimmed eyes betrayed her when she emerged to make coffee. Andrew sat at the kitchen table, his weather journal open before him, and immediately noticed her distress. "Ruth," his voice was gentle but firm, "what's wrong?" She turned away, busying herself with the coffee grounds. "Just sorting through some old things," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. At 6 in the morning, Andrew stood, crossing the small kitchen in 2 steps. "I heard you moving boxes. Please, tell me what's happening." The concern in his voice broke something inside her. Ruth's shoulders slumped as she gripped the counter, her knuckles white. "I have to leave," she whispered. "The landlord. I'm 3 days from eviction. I can't make the rent anymore." "But why didn't you tell me?" Andrew's voice rose in frustration. "You know I can help. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes." Ruth whirled around, her cheeks flushed with shame and anger. "That's exactly why I couldn't tell you. I'm not a charity case, Andrew. I've taken care of myself since Henry died, and I won't become someone's good deed now." "Is that what you think this is?" Andrew ran his hands through his gray hair in exasperation. "After everything we've shared, the meals, the conversations, the trust? Please." Ruth's voice cracked. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. You have Emily back now. You have a chance to be a grandfather. That's what matters." Andrew stared at her, his expression a mix of hurt and frustration. "You matter too," he said quietly. Then, shaking his head, he grabbed his coat. "I need to think. This isn't over, Ruth." The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in Ruth's chest. She sank into a kitchen chair, her hands covering her face as tears finally fell freely. The empty apartment felt colder somehow, as if Andrew had taken all the warmth with him when he left. The coffee maker gurgled its last drops into the pot, but Ruth didn't move to pour a cup. Instead, she sat alone in her quiet kitchen, surrounded by half-packed boxes and the crushing weight of what she'd lost, not just a home, but perhaps the dearest friend she'd known since Henry's passing. The days crawled by like molasses in winter. Ruth's tiny apartment felt emptier than ever without Andrew's presence. Each morning, she'd pause at his neatly folded blanket on the couch, her hand hovering over the fabric before turning away with a heavy sigh. At the thrift store, she threw herself into work, organizing racks of second-hand clothes with mechanical precision. Her coworkers noticed the change in her demeanor, but she waved off their concerned glances with practiced smiles that never quite reached her eyes. "Just feeling a bit under the weather," she'd say, straightening price tags with trembling fingers. By the 4th day, her feet dragged as she climbed the stairs to her apartment. The setting sun cast long shadows through the stairwell windows, and Ruth's joints protested each step. As she rounded the final landing, she stopped short. Emily stood at her door, holding a brown paper bag of groceries. Her young son clutched another smaller bag, bouncing on his toes with childhood energy. "Mrs. Miller," Emily said softly, "I hope you don't mind us dropping by." Ruth's throat tightened. "Of course not, dear." She fumbled with her keys, trying to hide how her hands shook. Inside, Emily's son helped unpack fresh vegetables, bread, and other staples onto the kitchen counter while his mother spoke quietly. "Dad's been staying at a hotel," Emily explained, placing a gallon of milk in the refrigerator. "He's been racking his brain, trying to figure out how to help without." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Without making you feel like it's charity." Ruth sank into a kitchen chair, her defenses crumbling slightly. "He's a good man, your father. But I've managed on my own for so long." "I know," Emily touched her shoulder gently. "He understands that. That's why he's taking his time, trying to find the right way." After they left, Ruth knelt beside her bed in the growing darkness. Her knees protested against the hard floor, but she clasped her hands tightly. "Lord," she whispered, "I'm not asking for rescue, just give me the strength to face whatever comes next. And," she hesitated, "watch over Andrew, wherever he is tonight." The morning air bit through Ruth's thin sweater as she struggled down the apartment stairs with a heavy box of books. Her arms trembled, and she had to pause at each landing to catch her breath. The cardboard edges dug into her fingers, but she pressed on, determined to handle this move with dignity. As she pushed through the building's front door with her shoulder, she nearly dropped the box in surprise. There, parked at the curb, stood Andrew next to a blue pickup truck. He looked transformed, his beard neatly trimmed, wearing clean khakis and a warm jacket that fit properly. The lost look in his eyes had been replaced by quiet purpose. Without a word, he crossed the sidewalk and gently took the box from her arms, his hands steady and sure. Ruth watched, confused, as he carefully placed it in the truck bed. "Andrew, she began, but he held up his hand. "Please, let me explain," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I found a house, nothing fancy, just a small 2-bedroom place about 10 minutes from here. It's got a garden space out back, perfect for those tomatoes you mentioned wanting to grow." Ruth's heart clenched. "I can't accept. The deed has both our names on it," he continued, pulling out a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Not as charity, Ruth. As family." Before she could respond, a car pulled up behind the truck. Emily stepped out, her son bouncing excitedly beside her, both carrying empty boxes. "Grandma Ruth," the boy called out, running to hug her legs. The word grandma struck her heart like a warm ray of sunshine. Ruth's eyes welled with tears as she looked at their faces, Andrew, Emily, and her grandson, all smiling back at her with genuine love. This wasn't an ending forced by eviction. This was a beginning, wrapped in the promise of belonging. "Family," she whispered, tasting the word like a prayer answered. The late afternoon sun cast golden light through the windows of the small house as Ruth stepped inside. The living room welcomed her with warmth from a crackling fireplace, its dancing flames already making the space feel like home. Her breath caught at the sight of honey-colored hardwood floors and walls painted in soft cream. "Come see the garden," Andrew said, leading her through the kitchen to the back door. Beyond the window panes lay a modest plot of earth, waiting for spring planting. "I remember you mentioning wanting to grow tomatoes." Before Ruth could respond, car doors slammed outside. Through the front windows, she saw familiar faces from the thrift store and soup kitchen, arms laden with covered dishes and shopping bags. "Surprise," called Mary from the thrift store, holding up a steaming casserole. Behind her, Tom from the soup kitchen carried a pair of floral curtains. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. "What's all this?" Andrew smiled gently. "I told them how you took in a stranger on a cold night, how you showed kindness when others might have walked past. They wanted to be part of welcoming you home." The house filled quickly with warmth and chatter as volunteers hung curtains, arranged furniture, and set up the kitchen. The aroma of home-cooked meals filled every corner. Emily appeared at Ruth's side, wrapping her in a tight hug. "I've always wanted someone like you in my life," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Someone who could be a mother figure." Her young son darted past them, his sneakers squeaking on the hardwood. Grandma Ruth, come see my room," he called, tugging at her hand. Tears spilled down Ruth's cheeks as she let him pull her along. Each room held another surprise, another gesture of love from this community that had become family. Her heart felt ready to burst with gratitude as she realized God hadn't just saved her from homelessness. He had restored her life in ways she never dared to dream possible. Snowflakes drifted past the windows on that December evening, each one catching the golden glow from the living room lights. Ruth settled deeper into her favorite rocking chair beside the crackling fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a winter scarf. The gentle rhythm matched the peaceful contentment in her heart. On the thick rug before the fire, Andrew sat cross-legged with his grandson nestled against him, an illustrated storybook open on their laps. His deep voice rose and fell with the tale's excitement, making the little boy giggle and gasp at all the right moments. From the kitchen came the gentle clinking of mugs and the rich aroma of cocoa as Emily prepared their nightly treat. Her humming mixed with the crackling fire and soft laughter, creating a symphony of home that filled every corner of the house. Ruth's hands stilled on her knitting as she took in the scene before her. Just months ago, she had believed her days of family gatherings and warm embraces were nothing but memories. Now here she sat, surrounded by love, her dignity restored through an unexpected journey of faith and trust. Andrew glanced up from the story, catching her eye. His smile held understanding. The same man she'd once found shivering on church steps had become the catalyst for her renewed life. As evening settled around their cozy home, Ruth gazed at the dancing flames and whispered a quiet prayer of thanksgiving for second chances, while outside, snow continued to fall softly on their blessed home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.